Welcome. There it is. Welcome everyone to tonight's program, which is program of Brown County Friends of the Library, or Friends of the Brown County Library. I am Wendy Wimmer. I'm going to be your moderator tonight as we host this Untitled Town program with Kate Washington, the author of Already Toast. And we're going to start this session. We're going to have Kate and I are just going to talk a little bit about the book that she wrote, which is available now on paperback. And then she's going to do a little reading. We'll have a couple of questions and then we'll open up to the audience. Now, if you go to the chat, you'll see that there's a chat. It is open. Everybody can see it. So if you want to hit chat and say hi to practice that out, now is the time to do so. If you would like to use closed caption, there is a closed caption API. You can put it into the closed caption reader of your choice. It is currently in the chat window as well. And if you want to use that for accessibility, please do. It works actually pretty smooth considering it's a live event. It works pretty smooth. So without further ado, and by the way, we have a poll going. So if you would like to vote on that poll, it's down on the bottom of your screen. And we just have some interesting questions there. And some of you have already found it. So thank you so much for participating in that. And we will keep that open and kind of check into that a little bit later. But first, I want to introduce my wonderful, wonderful friend, Kate Washington. Kate, this is your first published book, correct?
Correct.
But you are a long-time writer. You've been writing on the internet, in papers, nonfiction world, in academia for a long time.
Yes.
So no stranger to writing, but you had something very, very meaningful happen in your life that inspired this book. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. So about 7 years ago, my husband was diagnosed with a really rare form of lymphoma, a T-cell lymphoma that was so rare it didn't actually have a name. And when we saw the doctor about it, he was like, oh, well, it's just a string of markers. And they didn't really know how to treat it. At first, it seemed like it might not even need much treatment, but it quickly became clear that it was turning very, very aggressive and he needed really intense treatment, including eventually a stem cell transplant that had really devastating effects. So he was in the hospital from that for 4.5 months. At that time, he lost his vision. He lost the ability to walk. He couldn't eat. He has regained those things. He had 4 different eye surgeries, but his care needs were incredibly intense. And so I spent a long time. We also had pretty young kids at the time. My daughters were 9 and 5 when Brad, my husband, was diagnosed. So I was juggling parenthood, the functional loss of my partner. Though he was still alive, I didn't have any kind of partnership support, and indeed was, spending an enormous amount of time coordinating his care. And it really opened my eyes to the challenges that are being faced all over the US by millions, in fact, over 50 million unpaid family caregivers in the United States, disproportionately women of color, with incredible economic impacts and challenges. And it's really a hidden crisis that's only growing because of our demographic change that's coming as the baby boomers age. So what I really wanted to do in this book was tell my own story, which I tried to do in a really, honest and open way. So some of the book is pretty raw, but also talk about the cultural reasons and the socioeconomic impacts of why caregiving is as hard as it is in the United States today. So the book is mostly focused on the US context.
Excellent. So thank you. Would you mind there may be some people who have not been able to get their hands on the book, especially
Sure.
if you're in Green Bay right now. Lion's Mouth is sold out of the book. Especially if you saw Kate in the newspaper here locally, you may not be surprised that she's sold out. But would you mind reading a little bit from the memoir?
Sure. I thought I'd just start with the opening. The book, of course, is called Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. And the opening tells a little bit of the story of the title and kind of sets the scene I open with a scene that actually takes place after my husband's stem cell transplant and after he came home from the hospital when his care needs were really at their highest. So we'll start there. In despair, I typed caregiver into Google, planning to follow it up with resources or support group. The first search the autofill suggested, however, was caregiver burnout. I sighed and clicked. That morning, I'd cried my way through a miserable appointment with my husband Brad's oncologist. The news we had received had been no grimmer than any other development over the preceding 18 months of his treatment for a rare T-cell lymphoma, which had included a debilitating stem cell transplant. But on that hot July day in 2016, I was so exhausted by the caring grind that I could no longer cope. To my embarrassment, I couldn't stop weeping or even look up. I had always tried to project competence with Brad's physicians so they would take my questions seriously, but by 10 a.m., I was already worn out. I had spent the morning packing lunches, running our kids to summer camp, loading a heavy wheelchair into the car, wheeling my frail husband across hot asphalt, and picking up a dozen new meds from the Cancer Center pharmacy, all on not enough sleep and with the knowledge that bills, laundry, and plenty else were waiting for me at home. My good caregiver mask dropped. Tears fell on the coral-colored jersey dress I'd worn to try to present myself as capable rather than a frazzled disaster. As I broke down, the oncologist chided me for not taking good enough care of myself. If I didn't, he said, how could I take care of my husband? Fragile and overextended, I heard in that question an implication that the only point of me, as a human and not coincidentally a woman, was to care for another person. What about my own life? Didn't I deserve care in my own right? I left this office as silently as I'd sat in it, but fuming now instead of crying. The so-called self-care the oncologist prescribed felt like yet another task I resented, yet another obligation I had to fulfill. What I wanted was for somebody else to volunteer to care for me. Still, I dutifully went home and Googled, intending to look for resources. The top result for caregiver burnout was a quiz to determine whether the caregiver taking it was burned out. I took it. At the end, I got the breezy result, "You're already toast," illustrated with a stock photo of a charred piece of bread. But I guess you can't really see my cover, but it has a different charred piece of bread on the book cover. The website recommended taking more time for myself, getting a massage, going on walks, arranging for care so I could have an hour to myself, or even an occasional night away. But it said nothing about what to do if I was already doing those things and was burned out anyway. I spent more than 2 years as Brad's primary caregiver during the long, intense crisis phase of his illness. In the years since, as he's endured disability and chronic illness, my responsibilities have ebbed and flowed depending on his health. During the long crisis, I was so overwhelmed and eventually so burned out that sometimes I fantasized about simply turning around while driving to the pharmacy or the grocery store, heading to the airport instead, and buying a ticket on any plane going somewhere semi-tropical. I was 42 when Brad was diagnosed, and I joked to friends that I was having a very inconvenient midlife crisis. But under the dark humor lay a lot of truth. What stopped me from abandoning my life was the thought of the fallout. Likely endangering my husband's life, shocking friends, further traumatizing our already fragile children, inducing lifelong guilt by becoming a person who left her husband at his lowest point, alienating everyone I've ever loved, everyone who ever loved me. I stayed. Brad is no longer desperately ill, but he was permanently disabled by the after effects of his treatment. We worked hard, often painfully, to rebuild our marriage and our lives, and it's still a work in progress. In the long ordeal of his illness, his survival was the focus. If cancer is often described as a battle, a metaphor I dislike since it's hardly a fair fight, I feel like my life was collateral damage. I'll stop there.
Wow. Wow. What an opening. I put a link out there. If you don't already have the book, I'm sure you are desperately about to buy that book right now because you clearly need it for those of us in the audience. So Kate, that opening sets up such a stage in terms of what's at stake, what we're kind of dealing with, and also that double standard, that's Julia says,
Thank
yes,
you.
I'm buying it now. Yay. Um, and what's it like at stake for women? It becomes a very gendered expectation from society, even the oncologists who definitely should have known better, or just probably thought without thinking. So what, like culturally, what can we do as like, or is there anything we can do as a society that to recognize this impact of like familial caregiving responsibilities on women?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's one that the pandemic really like underlined and put a giant, exclamation point next to for so many millions of women, who had to leave the workforce because of care responsibilities, whether for elders or, ill people in the family or for children as well, in many cases. Um, I think I talk about this quite a bit in the book. There's such a long history of assuming that women's caring labor is free and to be freely given in the service, particularly of men. And that's painting with a very broad brush. Of course, there's millions of men who are caregivers. The statistics show that it's about 2/3 women who are unpaid family caregivers in the US, and also that women do more hours and do harder tasks and like more physically demanding tasks, suffer harder economic fallout as well. One part of the book that I haven't talked about yet, I have a lot of socioeconomic research and so on in there, but I have an academic background. I have a PhD in Victorian literature. And so one of the things that I also weave in is a look at books that have caregiving relationships in them, particularly classics from the Victorian period, when the idea of the woman as the selfless dispenser of care to her household, who smoothed the path for everybody, was of course paramount. There was, a name for this trope, the angel in the house, that comes from a Victorian poem. And so I really drew on that background of my own to look at, how are caregivers functioning in, Jane Eyre, in Middlemarch, in children's books that many of us, know and love, in Anne of Green Gables series, in Little Women, and then also in more modern books as well. But I was really interested in that because I went back to a lot of those books, which were old favorites, for comfort and to read, when I couldn't focus on anything else, when I was at the height of feeling burned out. And I was like, I never noticed all these care relationships in these books. And so I really wanted to write about it. It kind of sparked some new readings of, old favorite books.
Wow. I don't remember if you and I had talked about this before, because I know we talked about Jane Eyre and that whole overarching caregiving element in that, but I like Middlemarch is so, and by the way, amazing book. If anybody has not read Middlemarch, please do. You will just, your life will be so much better. But the element of Dorothea being married to Casaubon, who is like, sorry, I'm gonna nerd out for a minute, so please,
Sure,
everybody
please.
bear with me. Dorothea is married to this like ailing person, and she finds some happiness with his cousin visiting her, his younger male cousin visiting, and he sees this and puts it in his will that she can't get the house if she marries this guy. She can marry anybody else after he dies, but she can't marry this guy. And it basically is this overarching shadow throughout one of the longest books and classics, right?
Yeah. Well, and she doesn't know that that's in the will. And they
That's
actually
right.
try to keep it from her after
Yeah.
he dies. And one of the things that I write about also is that she has this kind of duty to him. The doctor tells her that he can't work on his great unfinished book because it will be bad for his heart. Like he may have a heart attack. And so the crux of it for this character that I write about in the book is that she has this kind of ethical duty to keep from him his own state. But he knows he's not well. And so he actually asks her to finish his book after he dies. So he wants to exert control and have her tending his legacy and really like performing a care relationship to him long after he's dead. And there's 30 years of age difference between them. it's a thing that would be very, very differently portrayed today, I think, for a lot of reasons. But it's I found that so interesting, the idea of tending memory and what it means to have the after effects of care go on, because care relationships end. In my case, my husband is much more able to be independent, so I'm no longer his caregiver. For so many people, they end in grief and loss, but the feelings around caregiving don't end. And often, as for me, I had to kind of stuff some of those away, or like not deal with a lot of the emotions just to get through the, amount of labor and challenge in the days of dealing with the intensity of his illness. It was, hours and hours a week. And the studies show that the average caregiver is spending 24 hours a week, and the average duration of caregiving is 4.5 years for,
Wow.
Unpaid family caregiving. So that's a long time, and a lot of labor, and a lot of deferring one's own needs in the case of many caregivers. And it all comes back later on to get you. So I was,
Right.
wanting to look at, how those things reverberate both in fiction and in real life.
And it's so deftly handled. I mean, your example of Dorothea from Middlemarch is it really parallels what's happening. She has to put her own interests aside while she's caring for his legacy and kind of building this thing that he, to be honest, probably wasn't talented enough to finish on his own. Sorry,
and she knows it's worthless.
Right.
Like, she has heard that, like,
Right.
as a work of scholarship, it's no good.
Right. And yet she's still doing it because she has so much guilt. And meanwhile, he is just, he's also impacted her happiness in this kind of dire, or safety, I guess, is really well paralleled with what we have now. Because now, even in the current pandemic state, and with people who are dealing with long COVID, on top of all of the other things that happen to frail humans, heart attacks and strokes and etc., you have this inability to complete our own, or this expectation of, our great works that have to be put on the side, our great passions, the paintings that we're not going to paint, the promotions that we can't get because we have to, work a part-time job, basically, for 24 hours a week. Can you talk a little bit about, like, I mean, we talked a little bit about the parallels within our current medical crisis and more historical elements of it. But like right now, when we're in this kind of pandemic state, which we're probably going to have another surge again, and I'm hearing a lot of people who are dealing with long COVID and, having effects of COVID that they had 6 months ago impact their life now. Like, what is at risk right now? And then is there anything that we can do? Which is a loaded question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like the pandemic both revealed a lot of the cracks in our systems, or rather our like non-systems of care, and also maybe opened up some opportunities for change and reform, which, sadly, I get worried that we're letting those opportunities slip by, by the day. We still don't have a federal paid leave policy, for instance, which would be a relief for so many families. And help with the economic impacts. Though I have just heard from like a caregiving network I'm in that the federal legislation that would include paid leave is coming back to the table after they do the confirmation. After they finish the confirmation hearings, they're going to take that package back up again. So, call your people, call your senators, and advocate for that, I guess, if that's of interest to you. I was so interested during the pandemic, and I should say I was finishing the book in March 2020. I was finishing edits of it, and was adding material, and was thinking like, well, if this is just going to be 2 weeks to flatten the curve, like maybe I shouldn't really talk about this. Everyone will have forgotten by the time the book comes out. If only. So I'm glad I put in some references, even though it was at a very early stage. And of course, I was also writing this before the 2020 election. So I didn't know what kind of things might be on the table, like if there was any possibility for change. But I thought a lot about, how much PPE, how many masks I wore when I was visiting Brad in the bone marrow transplant unit, how much hand sanitizer we had stashed by our door long before COVID started. And so for me, it was a little bit like revisiting a world that we had already been in. I felt like the rest of the world was kind of catching up to that feeling of like illness, disability. The world is very ableist, as we have been shown by COVID, among other things. And I also really thought a lot about all the people who are not getting any advocacy in the hospital. When visitors are prohibited from going, it's not just a loss of visiting and companionship, it's a loss of advocacy that can often be critical. Family caregivers often have like the most important information about the patient. And I remember this dynamic happening a lot with Brad. It always actually drove me a little bit nuts, because he would be absolutely like not doing well at all in the hospital room. And the doctors would come around on rounds and he would sit up more and they'd be like, "How are you doing?" He's like, "Oh, I'm doing pretty well today." And I'd have to be like, "He's not doing well today. We need to fix this." Because he wanted to kind of like put on a good front for them. And I'm like, front for me, but tell them the truth. Like, this is backwards, but there's so much importance to that care relationship. And we all saw sad stories too of people in institutional care and nursing homes who are without loved ones. So I think the pandemic really brought care issues just to the fore and showed the value of it, even as it undermined caregivers' ability to like do that work with people. So it's a real double-edged sword.
Look, I should have been taking notes because I have so many more follow-up questions. So I know I've shared this with you, Kate, but for the rest of the audience, my husband in 2013 had a traditional, like a hernia repair surgery, which went dreadfully terrible and through surgical error. And because of that, he almost died from sepsis. He was in the hospital for 42 days, much of that in surgical ICU. And during that time, I literally slept at the hospital for, I think there was a 3-week period where I slept at the hospital just nonstop. And it was because he was on so much painkiller for his systemic infection that he had and this series of procedures that were done trying to save his life, which he's fine, by the way, now. But we had a 42-day just marathon in the hospital. And then when we got home, it was like, oh, I feel like it's back. We're back to normal. We're back. Everything's going to be fine. And then it turns out it was like, oh no, I am fucked. Pardon my French, but like, you feel just like, you're like, why was I ready to get out of there? I had staff to like actually help. And now I'm in this house that nobody's been taking care of for 40 days, and now I have to take care. And God help me if I would have had children. I don't even know. But I mean, I still feel like I have PTSD from all of that. Yeah. Do you feel like you have PTSD from that? And yours is much more recent.
Yeah, or at least post-traumatic stress. I don't know if I would meet the criteria for the full diagnosis, but yes. And I have a chapter actually about that and like how PTSD for caregivers is becoming more recognized as a diagnosis. And yeah, I really like your point about the hospital is incredibly stressful. And then you go home thinking like, oh, what a relief. What a not relief. Like
not a relief.
The worst. And that was like the most stressful time for me. And I remember before Brad came home after his stem cell transplant, and I knew it was going to be rough because he'd had a hospitalization for like 19 days. The previous year, he'd had a burst lung tumor.
Oh God.
And he had a collapsed lung, and he came home and he needed IV antibiotics through his PICC line. And I was very surprised to learn that the person administering IV antibiotics would be me.
Right, through
And
a
that's
PICC line.
a characteristic that like a lot of people don't really realize until they're in the thick of caregiving, is that families are now expected to provide much more like hands-on, technical, highly trained medical care, except without the high level of training, with like 30 minutes of like, here's how you do this procedure. Like, don't introduce an air bubble, you might kill him. Bye. Good luck at home. And so I had experienced that and been kind of terrified. And then when he came home after this, after the bone marrow transplant, he had been in the hospital, as I said, for 4.5 months. And like right before he came home, that same oncologist who I read about a little bit ago said to me, you know, like, well, when he goes home, he can't be left alone even for a minute. He needs 24-hour like eyes on him.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, well, that what?
Yeah.
You know, like I have to sleep. I have to like take my kids to school. I need groceries, etc. And he's like, well, you know, usually family steps in and it works out fine. And I say this in the book, like I wanted to be like, well, is your family, where's your family? Are they free? Because mine is not. Like my husband is from Canada. His family, his parents had been with us for, you know, like 4+ months on and off. Like they'd gone back some, but I was like, they're gonna get like deported if they stay any longer to help us. You know, they can't stay that much longer. They have lives. You know, we didn't have, you know, nobody can provide 24-hour care at home safely and responsibly without seriously neglecting their own health, or often neglecting the care recipient. And we were really fortunate that we had savings that we were able to dip into, you know, and I paid for attendance around the clock for like 4 months. And it was wildly expensive and would be out of reach. I'm very well aware for many, many people. But that kind of out of sight, out of mind of like, well, like your family will step in. Like, do you have friends who can come over? It's like, my friends are not scrubbing out my husband's commode. I'm sorry to tell you, like, that is an unreasonable ask, you know? And the health system, I think, has in a lot of ways offloaded a lot of costs. Like a lot of cost cutting has led to a lot of very fragile people being sent home maybe earlier than they should be and not getting professionalized care and getting family care. And those costs are being directly borne by patients and families. And it looks good, I'm sure, on the balance sheet of for-profit insurers, and it looks very bad indeed in the bottom line of like regular people and their stress levels, but also their need to leave jobs. Female caregiver, one of the statistics that really shocked me when I was researching this book is that women who have been caregivers earlier in life are 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty in old age than their non-caregiving peers.
Whoa.
So it impoverishes people. And of course, it disproportionately impoverishes more marginalized, more economically precarious families, you know, all the time. So,
and anecdotally, I can tell you, we got released from the hospital literally a week later. So I had tried to take, because I was out of work, like I was like, I wanted to take family leave, and my boss was like, no, you're salaried, it's fine. You know, just check in and do your basics. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to work the normal 60 hours that I work. I'm going to work like, you know, 39 and a half. That's it. And they were like, no, it's fine. And so I never took family medical leave. They fired me for lack of productivity a week after we got home. And then I was out of work.
Yeah.
But then I think we have a mutual friend, Jen, whose son had a critical heart issue. And I was telling her about that, and she looked at me and she's like, well, of course they did. Everybody in the like the sick kid community knows that at least one parent loses their job. And it's like, awful. Okay, now what? You know, and it's, you know, with the expectation to it being the you know, the female mother in the family, and you know, it's definitely going to be an overwhelming impact for women and earning potential.
Yeah. And I would also say that, because in the US, healthcare is so tied to your job,
Right.
it often means that people are unable to take on caregiving fully because they have to keep the job so that there is insurance, or else you're bankrupted in another way. So
Mhm.
you're juggling these like impossible choices between, and we were very fortunate, I should say, like my husband had great insurance. He's a California state employee. I live in Sacramento. He taught at the state university here. So he was like a unionized California state employee with like, great leave policies, a pension, and health insurance that even though he's on a disability retirement, he has still been able to retain for the entire family. So I'm very well aware that we are like incredibly fortunate compared to the vast majority of families who face a catastrophic illness of the type that we had. And it still was not cheap and was not, and I stopped working basically entirely for about 2 years. So I lost out on a lot of earning potential. I mean, I'm a freelance writer, so I didn't lose out. It wasn't like I was,
It's
I
still
wasn't
not
going to be Jeff
nothing.
Bezos anyway,
Yeah.
but it could have been better than it was. So um it's it just, the way we have shunted care responsibilities onto individuals without any kind of systemic support. And I'm sure many of you know firsthand or know within your families how this impacts people, is just devastating for people. And it's not something that people can avoid. This is, Rosalind Carter has an institute around caregiving, and I saw a question in the chat about places to get involved, which I'll try to answer in a second. But she has a great, like, well-known quote where she says, everybody is a caregiver, will be a caregiver, will need care, something else. I'm paraphrasing, but it's really true. We're born like every single person came into this world needing round the clock care. And a lot of us will leave needing intense care as well and need it along the way. And it's part of being human. And it's a universal need that somehow our very individualistic society has decided is something people just have to scramble to do. And like, oh, you don't have time, like, oh, I guess you should have planned your personal responsibilities better for, and anticipated, that your husband would get a devastating form of cancer, or suffer medical mistakes, or whatever it may be, whatever catastrophe befalls a family. And it sucks. It just sucks. That's my non-eloquent ending. But there are organizations that are working on this problem. One that I would really recommend checking out is called Caring Across Generations. And I think they're caringacross.org. And they do a lot of advocacy, both around unpaid family caregivers, but also kind of the flip side, which is increasing paid caregiving, bettering labor conditions and so on for paid caregivers, which is really important if we are going to have respite care and good professionalized care in the home and appropriately value care for our elders and our most vulnerable people. We also need to be doing better at paying caregivers, giving them decent working conditions and secure jobs, good training, and thinking of it as the skilled and important job that it really, really is. Because devaluing care, it becomes this vicious cycle of devaluing and seeing it as like, oh, care is a priceless gift, but like economically it's worthless and doesn't have any, financial value attached to it.
I know you focus mostly on America. Are any countries in the world doing this right?
There are countries that are doing this better for sure. Not surprisingly, they are places with, robust social safety nets. And I talk about some places in my conclusion is really all about kind of practical solutions and policy change. And there are also states in the US that are doing more or having better policies or looking at policy change. Washington State has instituted some better policies supporting long-term care. My own state of California has paid family leave, one of, I think, now 9 in the US that has that. There are some states trying to do this better, but also on the international front, Japan has some innovative programs around elder care in particular, because it is such a rapidly aging society. And one that I thought was really interesting was they have like a care exchange system, because a lot of younger people don't live near their families. So they have things where you can volunteer to care for an elder who lives near you and get credits that somebody who lives near your beloved elder can use. Like, you can then get a care exchange where they go take care of your grandma while you take care of their grandpa, right? Like,
Oh my God.
big exchange program. And I haven't really looked at like the statistics on how well that is working, but it's at least something in place. Belgium has programs. I think the Scandinavian countries have programs. Ireland has some good options. A lot of the European countries, not surprisingly, they support this. There are some places where there is more direct pay for caregivers. There are a few limited programs in the US that do that, including through the Veterans Administration has direct pay for those caring for veterans. But part of the problem is we do have some decent like social programs in the US that can support caregivers, but they're very much patchworks. They're very hard to find. Some of them are, volunteer or nonprofit organizations, and the people they serve are really siloed. Like after Brad was doing better, and when I was writing the book, I connected, for instance, with a care organization here that serves a lot of caregivers in across the Sacramento region. And I was sort of like, well, why did I never hear of you when I was really in need of this? And it turned out that their entire mission and where their funding comes from restricts their services to people with cognitive impacts, things like Alzheimer's or anything brain related, which is an amazing and much, much, much needed service. I don't want to denigrate that at all, but it means that caregivers are looking, you kind of have to be like, okay, well, who's serving my specific disease? For people with rare diseases, this is really challenging. So it's a real patchwork. Depends on where people live, depends on what their state does, even like whether they take the Medicare waiver and all of these things, like what services are available to people, and puts the onus back on the caregiver to seek it out as well.
As if they don't have enough shit on their plate.
Just so.
Yeah. Sorry about the blue language. So we ran a poll amongst the audience, and it looks like 43% of the audience is currently taking care of someone unpaid. We have no professional caregivers. We have no one who is receiving care. We have 29% are, I'm not currently taking care of anyone, but I have in the past. And 14% say, I haven't taken care of someone yet, but I'm here to be ready. Good on you. Good, preparing. And another 14% says something else I'll explain in the chat. But before or while you're composing that message to that 14%, I thought we'd do a little bit of a giveaway and give away a copy of your book to be picked up at the Lion's Mouth in Green Bay, Wisconsin. They are sponsoring this giveaway. So Kate, could you pick a number? I'm looking at the registered attendees. Could you pick a number? And you must be on this call, by the way, to win. So if you're watching the recording later, I am sorry. You need to, be present to win. Would you pick a number between 1 and 27, please?
Oh, 17.
17. That is Kate Bodart. Kate, is that you, the Kate who doesn't have a last name?
Yep, that's me.
Congratulations! You won a copy of the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. And it looks like you're fairly local, so that should be not a problem for you to pick up at the Lion's Mouth down on Washington Street in downtown.
Yeah, I was just there today. So
Ah! Well, Amy will have it waiting for you. And congratulations. So thank you so much. Lucky person today. Now I thought we'd open it up to the audience questions. And by the way, Jolene said, I'm in the 14%. I get paid through IHSS for full-time caregiving of my daughter. Another comment, Sue said the VA provides lots of support for caregivers. My partner's a vet. And Kelly in the chat, and you kind of touched on this, is does anybody, maybe somebody in the audience as well, have recommendations for care advocacy groups to get involved with? So I had posted Caring Across Generations link in the chat as well.
Sorry.
You know, AARP also does a lot of advocacy and policy work around caregiving, and also is, I think, in terms of like resources online, is probably the best like one-stop shop for resources for caregivers. They just have a ton on their site around, you know, all the different aspects, because we haven't really touched on this, but one of the things that I really like to point out is that caregiving, you know, you hear the word and it sounds like, okay, it's changing a dressing on a wound, or, you know, bringing somebody soup when they're sick, but it's also legal and financial paperwork and managing appointments and dealing with end of life issues and cleaning the house. And it's often long distance care, which presents its own whole can of worms and is really challenging, and which I got a teeny tiny taste of. My husband got a second form of cancer after his stem cell transplant and had to go to a clinical trial in New York for a month to cure that cancer. We were like, really, another one? You got to be kidding.
Yeah.
But so he was in New York, you know, 3,000 miles away. And there was a lot of managing care from afar. So it was just like the smallest taste of long distance caregiving, but like all of the different kinds, sandwich caregiving, where people have multiple caregiving responsibilities and kids in the home and, you know, an elder or another person they're taking care of. Just a lot. But anyway, it's a good resource.
Excellent. Thank you. So audience, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can ask them in the chat and I will read them. Does anybody have questions for Kate? Otherwise, I will keep talking about Victorian lit and feminism, which is where I always go when we have a quiet spot.
Do you have any succulents left?
Are you talking to me or Kate?
To Kate.
Okay.
Oh yeah, if you Jolene is local to me and I posted something about succulents. If you want succulent cuttings, yes, DM me.
Do you do? Okay, I will.
Yeah. You can, another living thing to take care of, but not as demanding as many things. So.
Good question. If you're in Sacramento area,
yes, the local giveaways for, you know, succulent cuttings. So any other questions? Succulent or otherwise? Go ahead.
I don't have a.
Or does somebody else
Go
have a
ahead,
question?
Kelly.
Okay. I had a question about, you talk about how there's a lot of expectations from medical institutions that family provides care for, you know, people who are ill. And I was wondering if you've done any research or looked into it, or what you found on as far as elder care, and if that's true also in the case of elder care, that families are being expected to provide a lot more care on their own, either, you know, because that's what the system is demanding, or if that's because, you know, the system is so expensive to access that families are kind of taking that on.
Yeah, I mean, what my particular experience is not personally in elder care, though my mom and I did some care for my grandfather at the end of his life when he had Parkinson's. But my research really showed that these issues are kind of universal across forms of caregiving, and that elder care is like a huge part of it. So it's a little unusual in that I wrote the book about not elder care, but elder care is kind of the bulk of the caregiving crisis in a lot of ways. One of the things that I have seen is that within some places, like gerontologists, and that some of the system is a little better set up to acknowledge the care needs. And of course, institutions and like, there's more of an acknowledgement that that's going to be needed for many elders, and some places are trying to do it better, but it's still, I think, can be a really big challenge for families. And part of it, I think, is a lot of times people don't have the ability to be proactive about it. Nobody really thinks about it coming in time to buy the long-term care insurance that would make it easier perhaps down the road. I would say Alzheimer's is a really big piece of this, and there have been some great books out about that recently. But there's also a lot of advocacy in that field. One thing that I found really heartening in one book that I read, and I was on an NPR show with this author whose book came out at around the same time as mine, is a doctor named Jason Karlowich, who wrote a book called The Problem of Alzheimer's, and he's an Alzheimer's specialist who runs a clinic. And he talked about how at his clinic, they enroll the partner or the family caregiver as a patient as well. And they look at like a whole patient, a whole system of care within the family. And they think of the family as their patient because they know it will be such a long haul. And there are some movements, this is now outside of elder care, but there are some movements like Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. I've connected with a woman who does caregiving, like psychosocial oncology with a caregiving specialty. And she has a caregiving clinic where the caregiver is her patient. She's a psychologist. And when the caregiver brings their, as a spouse or a loved one with cancer to Sloan Kettering, they can potentially enroll as a patient in the caregiver clinic. So I think there are like pockets where it's starting to be recognized how much support is needed. But yes, elder care still remains like an enormous gap and challenge for families. And there's not a lot, I think, for a lot of people or a lot of family, there's not a lot in between nursing home and full-time at home. It can be really challenging to like find that middle where there's help and support for keeping loved ones at home if that's what families want to do. I hope that answers it and then veers away as well. So,
yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for that question, Kelly. Julia.
There we go. Yeah, I myself, I've been involved with elder care, first with my father, then my uncle, and then my mother. I'm out of old people, so I can just take care of myself now. One of the things that my mother and I found, I don't know, some 20 years ago with my father, is that they did have long-term care insurance, which was great. But boy, howdy, getting the money out of the insurance company, and they only paid up to 50%. For, I don't remember why now, it's been 20 years, but we had to fight like hell my mother had to pay up front, and then we had to pry the money out of the insurance company. And if it hadn't been for me, it wouldn't have happened. My mother was not equipped to do that kind of battle. I mean, we ended up doing a whole lot of good cop, bad cop, both with the facility that my father was in. It was a well-rated facility, but I hated every minute of him being there. I didn't think they took good care of him. And I told my mother was afraid to say anything because if she fussed, that maybe they would take it out on him. So I said, well, we're going to do good cop, bad cop. I'm going to be the daughter who comes in and raises hell, and then she'll soothe behind me. And that's what we did. I went in and pounded my fist and said, we are paying too much money for you to treat him this way. And my mother would say, she's a daddy's girl and she's very upset by this. And they were very sympathetic. but I would walk through the hall down to the nurse's station. They would see me coming and I would see them dispatch an aide to his room to see, has he been changed? Is he sitting up? What's going on with him? But, without that kind of advocacy, we needed two of us to advocate.
Yeah.
And I that was my first real exposure to, and we were in a good position. We did have insurance. We did have people, my mother and me, to advocate for him. And then when my mother got sick, 2013, I left my job. I was the only family member here in Seattle with her, and she wasn't going to go to a facility. She absolutely said, I'm not going to a facility. I will lie down on the floor and die before I go to a facility. So I was like, okay. And so I left my job to, it was only 6 months. She did die in 6 months, but it was a hard 6 months. And
Yeah.
it was, I was willing to do it. It's my mother. We didn't get along all that well. We had a difficult relationship. And at the end of it, she was my mother. What are you going to do? But the expectation from the rest of my family was that, well, of course, Julia will take care of it. And that shocked me that they loved me and my mother, but they were not really helpful. And I did not know how, in the midst of it all, to deal with that. And I've never really talked to them about how I felt let down by their casual assumption that, of course, I was going to turn my life inside out. Well, they said, you're doing a great job.
Yeah, I think that's really common. My heart goes out to you in both of those instances. And I think with the discussion of your father and how difficult long-term care insurance was, it's such a problem of a profit-driven system, where it's the margins are small, or they're going to people who are not the direct caregivers and not the recipients. And it's so, like, you do need like constant advocacy to stay on top of these things. Like, and I was quite sure, like, when Brad came home from the hospital, like, I'm quite sure that he was discharged when he was, despite how fragile he was, in part because he was coming to the end of the their negotiated length of stay with the insurance post bone marrow transplant, and they would have had to negotiate a new round and pay out a lot more. It's really tough. And then I think the family dynamics, I'm glad you raised that, because that's something we haven't really touched on very much this evening, but it's really tough. And like, families, the ideal would be that families would pitch in and spell each other, and everyone could get respite and share that fairly, but it really rarely works out that way. And it's so often, the daughter who's always been known as the responsible one, or so-and-so, and somebody's like, and it's that out of sight, out of mind thing. Again, the assumption that somebody will be doing the caring. And it's really, really tough on people. And it can create like really big rifts, in our case. I mentioned before, my in-laws came to help us, and it was invaluable assistance. I would not have made it without their help. At the same time, having my parents, my husband's parents living with us, observing me parenting 24/7, while I thought my husband was dying and while they thought their son was dying, was not always the most fun. And it was not great for our relationship. I felt like this is a big strain. It was a big emotional strain to have people, it wasn't my parents. So it was, people in my house I did not feel as comfortable with. And I didn't ever really quite feel like I was fully home during the couple of months that they were like living with us, even though I needed them and needed that help. So I'm aware that I'm fortunate, but it still like had, effects on family. And there were family relationships, and there were other family. And often, in a severe caregiving situation, you also learn which friends are really there for you and which ones are not so much. And that can be hard to cope with later. So it brings a lot of challenging emotions to the fore all the time. It was like, I felt like caregiving was like a crucible of all the like hardest emotions in life kind of all thrown into one. Even you know, it revealed so many things to me about my marriage, my relationships, myself, our society. You know, it radicalized me, all of the things. So
Well, I want this radical Kate Washington in our world, making it better for caregivers. And boy, howdy, Julia and Kate, you guys, I'm reliving my own situation where it totally does expose all of these raw nerves that you had no idea were there. And if I ever, like, if I have a trigger, phrase, it's just let me know if there's anything I can do. That is my trigger warning. And I think every caregiver is laughing right now because you know what a trap that phrase is. It's like,
right.
Like, why is it my deal? Why do I have to let you know what you can do? Can't you just freaking do something?
Right. People who get mad at you because you didn't ask them to do things for you, when there were like dozens of other people who did take the initiative.
Right.
There was like so many people who did do stuff for us. And then people coming along being like, well, why didn't you ask us to do anything? We didn't ask anybody.
Right.
They just didn't. Like, we didn't ask anybody. Go ahead and get mad at me if you want.
Yeah.
But I'm not, you can die mad about it. I'm going to be over here thanking people who took the initiative to take care of us.
Yeah. Yeah, you really do find out who just steps up to do things. And it isn't the people you expect either.
No.
It's often, I had a friend, I think she died in 1999. And her husband had cancer and she had cancer and she was in remission, but he died. And there was a crew of us, about 4 or 5 of her women friends, and we just stepped in and just started taking care of the house, getting them to their medical appointments, working together, and we just did it. We didn't stop to think, well, she can tell us what she needs, because we're thinking she's in a mess. She doesn't know what she needs. We're just going to do it. And she can tell us to stop. And she did die 6 weeks later. And it kind of primed me for my father becoming ill 2 years later, is that I had sort of a taste of what caregiving consisted of. And it really is, you just do what needs to be done and try not to think too hard about it. Just do it. And that, I think that carried through. If I thought about it too hard, I probably would have been paralyzed and wouldn't have been able to do anything. So I just, you pull a thread and you do it. But to tell you the truth, the last 8 years have been such a relief that I've only had myself to take care of. And I mean, I don't really have, I'm here in Seattle. I have no family here anymore. I have friends, but I expect at some point at the end of my life that I'm probably not going to have people to take care of me. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I think I'm kind of okay that, it just is what it is.
I'll take care of you, Julia.
Well, thank you. A little hard to do from Green Bay to Seattle, but no, I'm not asking for sympathy or anything. I'm really not. It's just, there is an awareness that there is only so much that is available. And honestly, getting involved in an advocacy group is a good idea. I've been looking for something to, with COVID, I pretty much got stopped a lot of the things that I was doing, and then I didn't want to go back to the things that I was doing. Mm-hmm. So the getting involved with advocacy might be a good idea. I've got experience and ideas on the subject, so that might be a good way to go.
I hadn't thought about it at all until you brought it up, Kate. And I think I'm going to look into it myself that's amazing. I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody have any other questions for Kate? I think I see Jolene's husband, Jesse. Hello, Jesse.
No, I appreciate that you wrote the book. I did just order it.
Thank you.
So, yeah, through bookshop.org with my
Great.
local bookstore, not Amazon. I am not an Amazon person. I would encourage all of you to never shop at Amazon ever again. So I'm sure most of you try not to.
Speaking of organization that gives you no benefits for family leave or anything like that. Yeah, and awesome. Libraries are good. There's the link again to our local independent Green Bay bookstore, and it queues up directly to Kate's book as well. I did put in the chat, we have a couple of upcoming Friends of the Brown County Library Untitled Town events. Kate, you're also going to be, so not only do you have your paperback book is just come out, you're going to be in a couple of places. If somebody wanted to attend your next virtual event or in-person event, where would they find you?
Well, actually, tomorrow night I am doing I'm the Wendy at tomorrow night's event, but I'm doing an event with a new author whose book just came out today about reclaiming our disability lineages and like thinking, combating ableism, like on a personal and like more broadly political level around disability. Her book is called All Our Families. Her name is Jennifer Fink, and it's an amazing book. And we're going to be talking about care and disability. It's another Wisconsin-based event through A Room of One's Own.
Oh, great bookstore. Great bookstore.
In Madison, I believe, correct?
Yep. Amazing bookstore.
So that's same time, 7 p.m. Central. So I'll be doing that event tomorrow night. And I have a few other things coming up. They should be on my website. I have an events page, though I think it's up to date. I hope it's up to date. And I have some in-person things. I have the San Leandro Public Library coming up in May. That's in person. I'm doing a workshop through Sacramento, a workshop on writing about trauma and difficult subjects through a writing workshop that they put on annually called Our Life Stories. So a small sampling of things that I will be doing. So,
and you've got a keynote coming up as well.
I do have a keynote, and that's at a caregiving conference, and it was supposed to be in March in Pittsburgh, and it was they delayed the conference they made the call at the height of Omicron, so it's delayed to September. And one thing that's not on there that I'm very excited about is I got invited to an oncology conference in Paris to give a talk in September. So,
oh my God, September in Paris.
That's my favorite one.
How can we attend that? Yeah.
So.
Excellent. Well, we will all see you all in Paris. I'll be there for your book signing, because unfortunately, the unfortunate part about book events or virtual events is we have no way to get your book signed for you. But go to Paris and become an oncologist so that you can go to this event and support Kate's great book. But what you can do is tell your friends and family about this great book and share the word. Of course, most books, something like 60% of books are get purchased because somebody said, oh, you must read this book. And I definitely believe that Already Toast is one of those books that could become the basis for a movement. So
I forgot, can I share my In the Wild sighting of it ish?
Yeah.
In the Wild hearing. I was shopping. Kate, have you been to Constellations in the R Street Gallery, the R Street Marketplace?
No, I have not.
Rumpelstiltskin and the Tea Cozy. It's in that same.
Oh, I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, so I was in there with my friend and we were shopping and we were talking about whatever, and I don't remember how book clubs came up. And she's like, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to go to my next book club. they picked this book and it's about like caregiving or something. And I said, is it already toast? And she goes, it is. I said, you need to go. It's so good. I can't even believe it. It's so excellent. You have to go. So hopefully I talked her into going to her book club, but I was so excited that like that was my in the wild.
Oh, that's funny. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So,
and thank you all for being Kate's street team in your varying communities. And thank you, Kate, for giving up an hour of your evening. This has been amazing. And I feel like I'm besties with all of you. Thank you for being so open and sharing and giving of yourself. This has been amazing. And oh, there's a kitty. So
well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks everyone for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
And hopefully
everyone,
once we get a date for a festival here in Green Bay, maybe we can talk about getting you to come out here as well. All right, everyone, have a great week. And I'm Wendy Wimmer signing off for Friends of the Brown County Library on Titletown, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.